And just what we'll cover today, just a little bit of housekeeping at first, and then I'll be introducing Altmetric, some of the basics of Altmetrics, Altmetric tools, and how to use Altmetric data effectively. So just some housekeeping. We are recording this session, and everyone who has registered for this webinar will receive a link for further reference, and you are most welcome to send that on to colleagues. Everyone's muted for the moment, but if you are experiencing any issues with audio or visuals, please do send a chat message for any assistance. And then if you have any questions along the way, you can type them into the questions box below. I'll make sure to answer those at the end. So just to introduce Altmetric, for those of you who are not very aware, or maybe you need this as a recap, a refresher, Altmetric is a data science company that looks at, analyzes and monitors online activity and conversations around scholarly outputs. And it is part of the digital science family of products, and it rests here where it looks at measuring that attention to those outputs. And it supports authors and researchers as well as research organizations at every stage of the research life cycle. This is Ewan Adey, who's the founder of Altmetric, and his vision was really to enable organizations such as universities as well as individual researchers to look at the broader engagement with the work that they produce. And so now I'll go into the Altmetrics basics, and basically it's a conversation about what exactly are Altmetrics. They can be defined as indicators of non-traditional attention as well as engagement with anything that is digitally published. So anything that you can find online, we want to look at those conversations about those outputs. It is literally a mashup of the terms alternative and metrics. So using this data to explain the nature of the attention and the reach that an output has received online. And then we can also measure and look at how many people research has been shared or has been engaged with online, and where it's happened and when it's happened. And the Altmetrics can also then provide some kind of engagement or at least a value to the outputs regarding these diverse audiences. And they're also complementary to bibliometrics, so your traditional metrics, which are mainly citation-based. So therefore, we think alternative in this sense is alternative to only using citations. This is also because a lot of the stakeholders that researchers try to produce and are producing do not necessarily reach certain individuals, and those individuals may not actually do active publishing or do research in certain disciplines, but they talk about it. So Altmetric is able to uncover these diverse audiences, whether or not they're general public. They could be someone who's an individual, may not be a scientist, for example, but is engaging with scientific literature. It could be government and policymakers, as well as nonprofit organizations that are looking at, looking for a cure for cancer, or are advocates of climate change. They could be also clinicians and practitioners, anyone to do with, research communications, and as well as, PIs and other interested parties in certain commercial enterprises. And therefore, Altmetrics does look at that reach. It looks at these trends in which research is being uncovered and talked about, potentially also then gathering a network of interested individuals outside academia, and they can then, provide evidence for the broader research impact. An impact can be split into two ways, academic impact or societal impact. So the two are kind of merged together, but they're also, I'm going to try and unmarry them here. Academic impact is mainly looking at your traditional metrics, which are your citations. So an example would be, my paper has been cited in another paper, or your paper has been cited in my paper. And then we're looking at the volume of publications. We're looking at the journal impact factor of where research is being published. We're looking at H indices. So that's purely academic in nature. Outside that, and where alternative metrics or altmetrics can provide wider engagement and wider pathways to impact, is looking at the conversations outside your non-traditional academic platforms. And that is usually looked upon in sources like social media, the news media and blogs, even in Wikipedia. We're looking at policy documents, and we're even looking at patents, for example. And essentially, citations do take a long time to accrue, and altmetrics are quite immediate and instantaneous. And this can be also due to the types of disciplines or subject areas in which research is published in, or where it's being published, and where online it can be found. And I like showing this graph, which gives you a typical timeline of attention to research that is published. So once an article, for example, in Nature or Wiley, or a book that's being published by Penguin has been released, first tweets might start to appear. So it might be a marketing or scholarly communications department that is actually promoting the work. Then other authors or co-author networks start getting wind of it. Eventually news and maybe blogs start picking up on it and start recommending and suggesting the content is helpful for ongoing projects, or it could be just of interest. People then start to bookmark it and share it out even more. And then we also have research highlights that start picking up on it. And eventually, this is where, after maybe weeks and months, citations start to accrue. Maybe years down the track, you'll start to see the research actually being mentioned in policy documents as well as patents. So how does Altmetric actually track for this kind of attention? First of all, I think some terminology is key here. So I will say the word output a lot, and that is literally referencing to some kind of individual research product. And that is mainly a journal article or a book chapter, but it can also extend to other types of scholarly products, such as presentations or even dissertations and theses, data sets, even media files. Then we're looking at the attention sources where this might appear in. So these are platforms where research is shared or even talked about. And those are the types of attention sources that Altmetric tracks. And then finally, it's the mention in those particular sources that Altmetric tracks. So again, the research outputs, these can be your articles and preprints, books and book chapters, data sets, media and cultural collections, clinical trial records, even individual and original news stories. So as long as it's scholarly in nature, that is how we would define a research output. These are the types of identifiers that are associated with those research outputs. So the most common one being a DOI, or a digital object identifier, but these other ones, such as ISBNs for books or handles that might be identified to a thesis in a repository, these are the types of identifiers that we're looking for. And finally, we look for those links, those identifiers to those research outputs in the Altmetric attention sources. So you might be familiar with the Altmetric donut with all the colors, and these colors correspond to the different types of attention sources. So where you will see a publication or a presentation that has a lot of blue, that means a lot of Twitter attention has been attributed to it. Similarly, if there's a lot of red, that means it's been looked at in the news. And the same with blogs for yellow and so on. So for the research to be tracked, we need that output, that journal article, for example, with its identifier, such as a DOI, and that has to be then linked or mentioned in a source that Altmetric tracks. And once we do that, we capture that attention and create this Altmetrics details page. So what we're looking for is following a list of domains, and we have relationships with many of the global publishers out there. It could be nature.com, tnfonline.com, even repositories such as Figshare. We look for the links to those domains in the attention sources. So we're looking at the attention sources like, news and social media, policy, patents, Wikipedia, etc. We collate those the attention across different versions of the output, and then we display it in this Altmetrics details page. And I'll show you some really, really interesting examples later on. So again, this is where research might live, and then we look at where it's being talked about. So this can be a scholarly conversation going on about in these non-traditional platforms, but it's also interesting to note what's outside academia. So the Altmetric donuts, the colorful badges that you might see on some publisher sites or your own repository if you have any, or if you just see them on a researcher profile site, what do they represent? Basically, the colors represent the sources, and the sources each have their own weighting. So that means it's calculated by an algorithm. And the score weighting is determined by these factors. So first of all, there's the volume. So obviously, once an output is mentioned many times, the volume or the score rises. However, we only count one mention from each person per source towards the score. And then we're looking at the sources themselves because each source contributes a different amount. So we're also looking at the score that is based on the relative reach of the source itself. And this example here illustrates that a news story from, say, the New York Times will be weighted higher than, say, a regional publication or news source. And then we're also looking at the authorship of these mentions. So who's actually mentioning this and what type of mention is it? So an example would be a science communicator or a practitioner sharing the research to a new audience. And it carries more weight than, say, the journal marketing team from that publisher tweeting the same link on and on. But here's a caveat. Altmetrics are not used for an indicator of quality. You actually have to dig into the data to understand what the Altmetric score is contributing to. Why is it a high number? Why is it a low number? And it is not a replacement for peer review or citations. So looking at the underlying data is quite crucial here, and actually can be fun, and it can create an interesting narrative if you're participating in any kind of assessment exercise or performance review, reporting on the breadth and reach of the research itself, or trying to increase the value of your research. So some of the tools I'll touch on today, I will mainly be showing you the Altmetric Explorer for institutions. So that is the flagship product that Altmetric has produced, and it is an online platform. It can be used to track and report on your research, your own actually individual institutions' research, but as well as others as well. And you can use a lot of filters to look at certain attention sources or even demographics, and in a range of dates, and even looking at particular times when research was mentioned. There's also the Altmetric institutional repository badges. These can be implemented and embedded within your institutional repository to socialize the donut and the colorful score so that others are more aware of other metrics out there to their research. And finally, there's also the Altmetric API, and this is used to gather raw data, and you can use that to mash up with other metrics. You can also conduct your review with other reporting systems that you might have, and it also presents some other interesting data feeds. So using Altmetric data effectively, this is where I am going to swap over to the Altmetric Explorer platform. Just give me a moment. And this is what it looks like. This is our demonstration instance. So it's our fake university called Lilliput University. And what we have with our partners, our partner institutions that are clients of ours, we implement their own verified research into the Explorer. So you'll have two views. You'll have your own institutional view, which is the default view when you log in. And then you'll also have access to the entire database that Altmetric tracks. And this is the first tab of 7. So this is the highlights tab, which was released not too long ago, a few months ago now. And it gives you a horizon scanning and information about the research that's in the system. So there's a total mentions, outputs with any kind of attention, and as well as the total outputs that are tracked. There's some breakdowns of where the attention is actually coming from, the top outputs by their Altmetric attention score, where most of these mentions are coming from, the top journals and collections that the research is published in, the top affiliations, the top subject areas based on the fields of research codes, some of the latest news highlights, some of the latest mentions, and you can tell by the source that these are all tweets. And then finally, we can look at the attention by region or even by the country. And then we also have the distribution of the Altmetric attention scores. If we also then go to the research outputs tab, you can see at a glance, anything with a blue tick here means that is your verified output, that you have verified this particular research as yours, belonging to the university. And everything is sorted by default by the Altmetric attention score, but we could easily look at, say, I want to see all of the attention from news stories. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an output with a high score necessarily. It could be something that was not even published very long ago, or it could have been published 10 years ago. In this case, in this example, this one was published in September 2010. We can also view the results as a list. So again, with your implemented instance, you would see who your authors are and the departments they reside in. You can also see the other affiliations. So this example shows that there has been another affiliation with Princeton University, and then the type of subject areas that this particular output has been attributed to. The timeline tab is also really interesting because you can conduct some trends. You can look at where attention has, peaks and troughs across your particular search. So this is for all of our big universities' research attention. You could just concentrate on, say, I only want to look at particular sources of attention, for example. We can also then dive into some demographics. So demographics will show where a lot of the Twitter, Facebook, news, and policy attention is stemming from globally. So this is a Twitter example. So we can see that a lot, say, is coming from China. A lot's also coming from Indonesia. We can compare that to, say, Facebook. We can compare that also to all of the news stories and outlets. And then we can also compare policy. And we are also improving some of the sources for policy, especially in the Asia Pacific region. We have the mentions tab, which is where you can drill down and actually look at, I want to look at news stories, and I want to look at news stories from, say, Japan only. And it doesn't matter what time frame, I will just apply this. And then you can find out where a lot of the news stories have been attributed to a Japanese news attention source. You can also then filter to say, I only want to look at tweets or policy documents, blog posts, Facebook posts, etc. The newly implemented mention sources tab is also really fascinating in the sense of looking at the networks that are actually contributing or could be influential when you're promoting research. As an example, I'm just going to also look at Japan. And I want to look at who has actually been tweeting about our research and is based in Japan. So we can see here it's been sorted by default, who's got the most mentions, but you can also sort by the follower count just to see what the reach is like. So for example, this tweeter has mentioned something in a Twitter feed, but has actually quite a great reach of 180,000 followers. You can see those latest mentions, and we can see which output it's actually been tweeting about. You can also then filter to original tweets as well as retweets too. And finally, the Journals tab, and that shows where your research has been published, and you might be interested to note whether or not these are hybrid open access journals, whether they're your big publisher journals as well, whether they're actually on a repository platform such as Figshare, for example. And you can sort that by the total mentions, and then actually look at all of the different mentions by attention source. Everything in these tabs are downloadable, so they're exportable into a CSV, so you could do some extended reporting. If your Access also has an API, you can also then gather all of this information via the API and do some interesting things with your other in-house systems. As an example for the quick search, if we switch over to the full Altmetric database, we can just write in something in the quick search. It'll pick up some words depending on the keywords that I've used. Climate, so it'll try and determine what is my search pertaining to. So it could be an output that contains keywords climate, a title, a journal, a funder name even, or an affiliation. If we go into the advanced search, this is where it gets really interesting. And so you can look at the full Altmetric database. You can then also look at and compare and benchmark your own institution with others. And this affiliation comes from our sister company, Dimensions. And all of our institutes are disambiguated by the GRID database. So for example, if we wanted to look at University of Hong Kong, we could look at, say, all of the outputs that have been affiliated with the University of Hong Kong and compare their attention to our attention. You can also then look at the titles of outputs, the types of outputs, the open access status. So that's where you can do a lot of trends analysis and just to see where regionally have certain open access publications from your institution or a peer institution, are they getting more attention, essentially? You can also then look at scholarly identifiers. So you can copy and paste up to 25,000 different scholarly identifiers. So if you recall, those different identifiers are mainly, DOIs, but they can extend to our ISBNs, PubMed IDs, etc. So that's where you can do some comparisons as well. You can even find research outputs by someone's ORCID. So if you're thinking of comparing some of your researchers to another one that you want to poach for your department, you can actually find out what's linked to their ORCID ID. If you're also fluent in the language of PubMed, you can even do a PubMed query. And then, of course, you can also look at the attention by the dates and Altmetric mentions during a certain time frame. On this side, this is where we would import your own verified outputs. So you could look at the attention to your verified authors and their departments. You could look at the publishers and journals and collections that they actually are published in. You can also search by funder names. So what we're seeing now, especially in the Australasian region, is seeing whether or not a lot of the funded research is getting a lot of attention and where those international networks are. Australian universities might get a lot of funding from, say, Japan or Singapore, or even the US or the UK. For the purposes of this, I think I'll just leave University of Hong Kong and run a search. It might take some time. So in the meantime, while that's loading, I just wanted to show you some interesting outputs with some interesting scores. So this is just an example of the Altmetrics details page for an article that has been published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution in May 2017. And even just the name itself, you wouldn't have guessed that this particular output has to do with environmental sciences. What's interesting about it is that it's had some, valuable attention here. It has no citation counts, but it's had some readership that we've captured in Mendeley. So each of these different details pages will give you some Twitter demographics, if any, with a demographic breakdown and where those tweets are coming from. Mendeley readership is similar in the sense of we try and capture geographical breakdowns and demographics if the profiles are being populated. What's also interesting to note is the attention score in context. So the Altmetric score is only at the output level, but it's also interesting to note that when this particular output entered the Altmetric database, and because of its score, we've decided to put some kind of context around it. So out of 14.5 million different outputs, this is its ranking according to its score. The outputs from that particular journal, and then the output of that in a similar age and of a similar age from that journal. So you can write some interesting narratives about its context, its score in context. You can then explore further if you have a link to the or access to the Altmetric Explorer database. You can go straight to the publisher site, and these details pages do give some kind of value to the individual researchers so they can be alerted by new mentions. So as we can see, this was published in May 2017, and it's had a lot of news coverage from that time it was released. For the blogs, it took nearly a year later, and for Twitter, we can also see where the most recent tweets have happened, the types of followers that these Twitter profiles have, and you can go straight to the Twitter profile, and then the Facebook attention. Another example here is a gun law reform and about mass shootings. I wanted to show this particular example just because it's had you can see from the colors, it's had a lot of attention from various different sources, as you can see here. It's had a lot of citations, and we gather all of those citations from Altmetric's sister company, Dimensions. So you have the alternative metrics here, but you also have a comparison and a complementary metric here to the citations. If I just open this up and see it in the Altmetric Explorer, what's really interesting about it is to look at the timeline. It was published back in 2006, but it's gained a lot of attention here and there, probably and most notably because whenever a mass shooting happens, this particular piece gets referenced. So not just in academia, but also outside academic platforms of conversations. This is another example of a particular output that was recently published in August 2019. It's had no citations yet, but it's had a lot of coverage in the sense of the news, global news outlets, the most recent one being only 2 days ago. On Twitter as well. So a lot of conversations now about academic literature and about academic research is being communicated on a lot of social media channels. And then a lot also can be found on Facebook, in the sense only one. And we do only count the public wall posts. We can't track anything that's private. But the most important thing to note also is that all of these mentions are fully trackable and auditable. So you can see who is actually engaging with the output, what are they saying, how is their mention impactful. Now, if we go back to our original search for University of Hong Kong, this is what the Altmetric database has managed to find. It's tracking 28,000 different outputs, and about nearly 19,000 have some kind of attention. You can see there's no blue tick here, so we are definitely looking at an external affiliation here. So this is how you can also save a search, for example, and use it for later analysis. And this is where the saved searches are. So this is where it comes in handy for scholarly communications teams, department heads, and other individual researchers. They can look at, based on a search, based on search terms, based on affiliation or time frames, where the Altmetric attention has stemmed from, and create their own report. This can be editable and shareable as well. I think what's also interesting to note from our search, if I just go back, we can then focus on, say, we want to look at the mentions that are stemming from certain Asian regions. How are they actually, what are they saying? Are they meaningful? If we look at, say, original tweets only and news stories from Japan and Hong Kong and Malaysia, we can focus on that, export this, and do some analyses. You might even uncover some influential users out there who communicate a lot about your research. You can make new networks. You can find out whether or not certain journalists are worth pursuing when you're interviewing. And you'll also see whether or not some of these influential networks are actually regionally covering their own research, or are they actually, do they have any international collaborations? I'm just going to go back to the presentation now. And hopefully that gives you some kind of idea of how you can use the Altmetric data effectively through the use of the Altmetric Explorer. And so using these data and tools, essentially you can uncover the reach, look at some influences of your publications and other scholarly outputs. This can be then used for also reporting on the performance and to build those interesting narratives, especially for early career researchers who may not have citations just yet, but we can see that some outputs have immediate attention on these different and non-traditional platforms of conversation. It's also about creating engagement strategies. So you can see where maybe there's some gaps in which you should be actually talking to a particular source of attention or a certain news outlet or a certain blogger. You can also then understand where a lot of the research is being talked about the most and whether or not you can capitalize on that. You can also use the Explorer to compare and benchmark that activity with your research, but also amongst other institutions. It could be other topics of research, and it could also be just focusing on a particular attention source. And that way, when you have researchers or department heads or stakeholders saying, what are people actually saying? You'll have some interesting answers to tell them. Again, one thing that I will also say for early career researchers, PhD students, anyone who's actually entering academia for the first time, make everything as discoverable as possible. And here are just some hints and some tips. Start talking about your research. Promote it as well. Don't just rely on publishers to market it for you. You can also, write something and put it in a newsletter. You can upload it and make it available on your institutional repository or an open platform, such as Figshare. Reach out to certain individuals that you may be aware about, like bloggers. Also promote it on your work signature, your CVs, and other institutional profiles. Even just working with the institutional press and communications office. And of course, we definitely recommend putting everything on your ORCID. Another way in which you can also make your work as discoverable as possible is to publish open access where possible, and then promote it that way through social media. And that is a very brief overview of how you can get something that may not have much attention, but after which, if you can promote it, you might have some colorful donuts to show. And that is a very brief overview about Altmetrics and how you can use the platform, especially now where a lot of the conversations are not just happening in English-speaking countries, but also globally in other parts of the world, in other regions. Different kinds of research gets different kind of attention. And it's also interesting to note where it's being published, what language it's being published in, and how you can maximize on that. So please get in touch if you'd like to have a more in-depth demo and conversation. My contact details are here, and I'm open to questions if there are any. If there aren't any questions, please do get in touch. If you have any particulars or particular queries or questions, or if you'd like to have a more in-depth demo with you and colleagues, just contact me at s.guichard@digital-science.com. Thanks very much for your time.